Priya Nair had been cataloging donated regimental items for 11 days before she found the thing that wasn't supposed to exist. The basement archive at Wellington Barracks smelled the way all serious archives smell: cold stone, old cloth, and the particular stillness of air that hasn't been disturbed in decades. She didn't mind it. She'd grown up in libraries, had written her entire postgraduate dissertation surrounded by that same quality of silence, and had learned early that the most important things were almost always filed under the wrong name. The crate was on the third shelf from the bottom, pushed to the back behind 2 boxes of donated mess silverware and a rolled canvas that turned out to be a water-damaged regimental map of the Crimea. Its label was handwritten in faded brown ink on a strip of cardstock tucked under the wire clasp. MISC, textile damaged, pre-1900, no date, no donor name, no catalog number. She almost moved past it. The clasp was stiff, the kind of stiff that comes from decades of disuse rather than damage, and when it finally gave way, the smell that escaped was different from the archive around it. Sharper, older, like cedar and something she couldn't name, a preservative perhaps, or simply the concentrated scent of age doing its work undisturbed. Inside, wrapped in a double layer of oilcloth and packed with horsehair padding that crumbled slightly at the edges, was a coat. Scarlet wool, not the bright parade ground scarlet she'd seen on the guards outside. Something deeper, more complex, a red that had lived through weather and smoke and 2.5 centuries of careful darkness. The cut was wrong for anything after 1780. The collar facing was hand-stitched in a pattern she'd seen in exactly one place before, a plate illustration in a regimental history textbook that she'd borrowed from the British Library and never quite returned. She set down her clipboard. The brass buttons were stamped with a crown and a regimental device she didn't immediately recognize. The wool itself was a weight she hadn't expected, thick, dense, the kind of fabric that wasn't made for appearance alone. She turned the collar carefully, using the edge of her sleeve rather than her bare fingers, and found the inner collar stamp. A regimental number, hand-inked still legible. She photographed everything. 12 shots from different angles, collar stamp close-up, button detail, the oilcloth wrapping, the horsehair packing, the label on the crate itself. Then she went upstairs to the archive office, opened her laptop, and spent 40 minutes cross-referencing the regimental number against the National Army Museum's digitized muster rolls. The number appeared once, in a 1745 document. And then she found the War Office destruction record, dated September 1943, bomb damage assessment, regimental stores, item listed as destroyed in transit during Blitz evacuation, status, confirmed lost. Priya sat back in her chair and looked at the photograph on her screen. The coat that had been destroyed in 1943 was sitting in a crate in the basement 40 feet below her. She picked up her phone and called her supervisor. The photograph arrived on James Ashworth's phone at 6:42 in the morning, forwarded through the National Army Museum's Heritage Alert System, with a priority flag he hadn't seen used in 4 years. He was already awake. He was always already awake. 30 years in regimental heritage consultation had given him the sleeping habits of a man perpetually waiting for something to go wrong, which, in his experience, was a reasonable adaptation. He read the alert message standing at his kitchen window with a cup of tea going cold in his other hand, and then he looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. The collar stamp was visible in the third image, clear enough. He set down the tea, went to his study, and pulled a ring binder from the third shelf, the one that contained his own field notes from the mid-1990s, when he'd spent 8 months cataloging the surviving Fontenoy-era tunics held across 4 different institutions. He found the page he wanted, cross-referenced the stamp number, read it twice. Then he called the museum's director. By 8 o'clock, he was on the road to Wellington Barracks with a worn leather case in the boot of his car. The same case he'd carried to Sandhurst, to the Tower of London, to a private estate in Shropshire where someone's grandfather had kept a Waterloo-era sword wrapped in a curtain for 60 years. Inside the case, white cotton gloves, an archival reference loop, a portable ultraviolet lamp, and a battered copy of the 1743 clothing warrant that he'd annotated so thoroughly over the decades, it was barely the original document anymore. He wore no uniform. He held no current military rank. His ID identified him simply as a consultant to the National Army Museum, Heritage Assessment Division, which was the kind of credential that opened doors without triggering conversations. The barracks were already busy when he arrived. A changing of the guard preparation was underway in the front yard, the familiar choreography of polished boots and measured timing, tourists already gathering at the fence with their cameras. Ashworth walked past all of it toward the administrative entrance, showed his ID to the duty corporal, and stated his purpose. Routine textile assessment, prearranged with archive staff. The corporal didn't check. He was watching the tourists. Ashworth signed in and went downstairs. Priya Nair was waiting by the crate with the careful, slightly anxious energy of someone who has found something significant and spent the night worrying they might be wrong about it. She was not wrong about it. Ashworth knew that from the doorway. He crossed the room, set down his case, pulled on his gloves, and crouched beside the crate without touching anything yet. He looked at the oilcloth wrapping, the horsehair packing, the way the coat had been folded along lines that suggested someone who understood how wool of that age needed to rest to avoid permanent crease damage. Whoever had hidden this had known exactly what they were hiding. He looked at Priya. She was watching him with the quiet intensity of someone who has taught themselves not to speak when the other person is thinking. He approved of that. "Close the door," he said. It took Ashworth 40 minutes to complete his assessment, and he did not rush a single moment of it. The ultraviolet lamp confirmed what the naked eye already suggested. The dye composition was pre-synthetic, matter-based, the specific red that British military outfitters had used from the mid-17th century until the introduction of aniline dyes in the 1860s. The wool weave count matched the specifications outlined in the 1743 clothing warrant precisely. The regimental facing, the deep blue cloth stitched along the collar and cuffs, was hand-sewn with a needle gauge that hadn't been standard since the 1750s. The buttons, he examined each one under the loop. The crown stamp was a pattern used for exactly 11 years, 1741 to 1752, before a design revision updated the royal cipher. And the inner collar number. He had the muster roll entry photographed on his phone. He placed the phone beside the collar and compared them directly, character by character. Identical. He straightened up, removed his gloves, and stood for a moment looking at the tunic laid out across the archive table. It was smaller than modern people expected. The men who had worn these coats had been lean, conditioned, shaped by lives that didn't include surplus. The sleeves were cut for movement rather than appearance. The wool was heavy enough to deflect a glancing blade and thick enough to hold warmth in the field. This was not a ceremonial garment. It had never been one. He was writing his initial assessment notes when the door opened. The man who entered was in his late 50s, broad across the shoulders, wearing the kind of bearing that comes from decades of institutional authority rather than physical intimidation. Brigadier Gerald Fenn did not introduce himself. He looked at the tunic on the table, then at Ashworth, then at Priya, who had gone very still near the shelving. "I wasn't informed there was an assessment scheduled for today," Fenn said. "It was arranged through the museum's Heritage Liaison office this morning," Ashworth replied. "Routine verification following a flagged discovery." Fenn walked to the table and looked at the tunic with an expression Ashworth had seen before, not ignorance, but calculation. The look of a man reassessing the value of something he'd already assigned a value to. "This came from a donated crate," Fenn said. Regimental property. Donated items fall under the discretion of the regimental administration. That would be correct, Ashworth said, if this item were regimental property. The muster roll origin and the War Office destruction classification from 1943 both indicate otherwise. Items with active War Office provenance records don't transfer to regimental discretion regardless of physical location. Fenn's jaw tightened slightly. The destruction record means it was written off. Written off property has no active provenance claim. A destruction record for an item that wasn't actually destroyed creates an administrative irregularity, not a transfer of ownership. Ashworth kept his voice the same temperature it had been since Fenn walked in. The item still exists. The original ownership designation therefore still applies. There was a silence in which Fenn looked at the tunic again, and Ashworth watched him look at it, and Priya watched both of them. "I have a meeting with Belmore's this afternoon," Fenn said finally. Belmore's was one of the 3 auction houses in London that specialized in military heritage. He said the name without any particular emphasis, which was its own kind of emphasis. "I'd recommend postponing it," Ashworth said. "On what authority?" Ashworth picked up his phone and made a call he had already known, since 6:42 that morning, that he was going to have to make. Dame Catherine Holt arrived at Wellington Barracks at 11:30. She did not arrive with a retinue. She did not arrive with a press officer or a legal team or any of the apparatus that senior institutional figures sometimes used as a reminder of their own importance. She arrived in a dark blue saloon car driven by her own assistant, carrying a slim document folder under one arm, and the specific quality of attention that Ashworth had observed in her for 20 years, the kind that took in a room completely within 3 seconds of entering it. She was shown to Brigadier Fenn's office rather than the archive. That had been Fenn's choice, his ground, his furniture, his regimental photographs on the wall. Ashworth recognized the tactic. Holt gave no indication she noticed it at all. The tunic had been carefully repacked in its oilcloth and placed on the side table in the corner. Priya had remained with it throughout, which Ashworth had not asked her to do and had not told her not to do. He noted this about her. Fenn made his case first. He was composed and methodical, and not without genuine conviction. The barracks' east wing roof had been assessed 6 months ago and classified as structurally compromised. The renovation estimate was significant. Heritage funding applications had been submitted twice and rejected twice. The regular budget allocation was insufficient. Soldiers were training in a building that, in his assessment, represented a duty of care failure waiting to happen. The tunic in Fenn's framing was a solution. A private sale to a serious collector, properly documented, properly valued, with the proceeds directed entirely toward the renovation. No profit motive, no personal gain. A practical decision made in the interest of the living over the long dead. He was not wrong that the roof was failing. Holt listened to all of it without interrupting. When Fenn finished, she opened her document folder and placed a single sheet on the desk between them. It was a letter, handwritten, on War Office headed paper. The ink had faded to brown. The date at the top was March 1746. The letter designated the tunic by regimental number, by description, by the name of the officer who had worn it at Fontenoy, as sovereign military property, to be preserved in perpetuity as a record of British military service. It was signed by a War Office administrator whose name meant nothing now, but whose authority in 1746 had meant everything. Below the original signature in different ink and a different hand was a second notation, dated 1943, a name Ashworth recognized, a regimental archivist who had been stationed at Wellington Barracks during the evacuation of London's institutional collections during the Blitz. The notation read simply, "Item secured. Destruction record filed to prevent requisition. CHR." Holt let Fenn read it. He read it twice. "He hid it," Fenn said finally, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite what Ashworth had expected, not anger, not embarrassment, but a kind of reluctant recognition. My predecessor's predecessor. He filed a false destruction record to keep it from being requisitioned. To keep it from being melted down for the war effort, Holt said. Which is what was happening to institutional metal and material collections across London in 1943. He made a decision to protect it, and then apparently told no one, which is why it's been in a crate in your basement for 80 years without anyone knowing what it was. Fenn looked at the tunic on the side table. I didn't know what it was either, he said quietly. It was the first thing he'd said that wasn't a legal or administrative argument. No, Holt agreed, which is why we're having this conversation rather than a different one. She picked up the 1746 letter with the careful two-handed grip of someone who understood what she was holding. The roof is a genuine problem, Brigadier. I'm not dismissing that. We'll submit a joint application through the Heritage Infrastructure Fund. The museum has standing there that the barracks alone doesn't. It will take longer than a private sale, but it will happen. Fenn was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the same careful control he'd maintained throughout, that coat is worth a considerable sum. Holt looked at him with an expression that was not unkind and not negotiable. That coat kept 10,000 men standing, she said. You don't auction courage. The office was very quiet. Outside the window, somewhere across the parade ground, a sergeant was calling out a drill sequence in the flat, carrying tones of someone who has given the same instruction several thousand times and will give it several thousand more. The rhythm of it came through the glass like a pulse. Fenn looked at the 1746 letter for a long time. Then he nodded once, not in defeat exactly, but in the specific capitulation of a man who has been shown something larger than his own problem and has chosen to acknowledge it. I'll contact Belmore's this afternoon, he said. Thank you, Holt said. Ashworth repacked the tunic himself. He had brought acid-free tissue from his leather case specifically for this. He laid it across the archive table in overlapping sheets and placed the tunic on top, smoothing the wool flat with gloved hands before beginning the fold sequence. Sleeves in first, along the original crease lines. The collar turned down gently, the body folded in thirds. He worked without speaking. Priya stood to one side, not helping, not leaving. The room had the quality of atmosphere that serious archivists recognized, the particular gravity that gathered around objects that had survived longer than anyone had a right to expect. The tunic had been at Fontenoy. That was the thing he kept returning to as he worked. The Battle of Fontenoy, 1745. The British infantry advancing across open ground toward French artillery positions in formation in daylight in their scarlet coats, taking fire, not breaking. The French commanders had reportedly observed through their field glasses with something approaching disbelief that these men were absorbing casualties and continuing to advance, and that the red of their coats showed nothing. No visible wound, no spreading dark stain. The color held the damage. The scarlet had not been chosen for pageantry, not originally. It had been chosen because red wool, when wet with blood, looked the same as red wool in daylight. A man who had taken a wound and was still standing looked, to the enemy, like a man who had not been touched. It denied the enemy information. It denied the men beside the wounded soldier reason to panic. It was psychological warfare stitched into a clothing warrant, and issued to every infantryman who drew breath in the British Army for 200 years. They had worn red, so their enemies couldn't see them bleed. He placed the folded tunic into the archival transport box he'd brought from the car and secured it with the padded internal brackets. The box was temperature-rated and impact-resistant and biometrically sealed, which was, he thought, considerably better accommodation than the oilcloth and horsehair the 1943 archivist had managed. He signed the chain of custody form on his tablet. Priya countersigned as witness. What happens to it now? She asked. Conservation assessment, probably 3 months of work before it can be displayed. He closed the box. Then it goes in a case, climate-controlled, proper lighting. Will it say why they wore red? He looked at her. It will, he said, that's the point. She nodded, and he picked up the box and walked upstairs. The service courtyard at the rear of Wellington Barracks was in full morning light by the time Ashworth came through the back entrance. No press at this gate. No tourists. Just a loading area and a collection of vehicles and a corporal who checked his ID and waved him through without ceremony. He had not requested an escort. The museum had offered one, a security vehicle, a second consultant to co-sign the transfer at the receiving end, the full institutional apparatus of a significant acquisition. He had declined most of it. He had the transport box, the documentation, and his own car, which was a 12-year-old Volvo that had carried more irreplaceable objects in its boot than he could accurately remember. He was loading the box when he became aware of someone watching from a first-floor window above the courtyard. Fenn, standing in what was probably his office window, arms at his sides. Not concealed, not pretending he wasn't there, just watching. Ashworth didn't wave. He didn't nod. He finished securing the box in the boot, closed it, and walked around to the driver's door. Whatever Fenn was working through up there was his to work through. The gate opened without being asked. Someone had called ahead. He drove out into London traffic, the kind of mid-morning density that moved in stops and surges, and found himself thinking, not for the first time, but with a particular clarity, about what it meant to protect something nobody knew was missing. The archivist in 1943, CHR, had filed a false document to save this coat from being requisitioned and destroyed. He had done it alone, told no one, and died without the record being corrected. For 80 years, the tunic had sat in a crate in a barracks basement, officially non-existent, waiting. It had survived the Blitz not in a vault but in obscurity, which was perhaps the more honest shelter. Ashworth had spent 30 years in this work, and had come to believe that heritage institutions were not the reason things survived. The reason things survived was individual people making quiet decisions, filing a note in a crate, pushing something to the back of a shelf, leaving a record that only made sense 80 years later to a postgraduate intern with good instincts, and a borrowed library book she'd never returned. The museum came afterward. The museum gave it a case and a label and a temperature-controlled room, but the survival itself was always somebody's private act of stubbornness. He pulled into the museum service entrance at 12:43 and parked in the loading bay. The receiving curator, a careful young man named Barrett who Ashworth had worked with twice before, was waiting with a trolley and a transfer form. They moved the box inside without conversation beyond the necessary. Temperature log, custody signature, condition notation. Ashworth initialed each section. Barrett countersigned. The thing was done. At the door, Barrett paused. "Do you want to see where it'll go?" he asked. "The conservation lab is set up, we could." "No," Ashworth said, not unkindly. "That part's yours." He walked back to his car. The loading bay door closed behind him with the soft pneumatic compression of a properly sealed environment, which was, he thought, exactly the right sound. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, without starting the engine. He had not prevented a crime, precisely. Fenn had not known what the tunic was worth in the way that thieves knew what things were worth. He had not saved a life. He had not done anything that would be reported anywhere, because the museum would handle any public announcement in its own time and its own way, and his name would appear in the transfer documentation and nowhere else. He had found a coat that had been officially dead for 80 years and returned it to the living. He started the car. The specific red of that wool, that deep, complex, smoke-hand darkness red that was nothing like the bright scarlet on the guards outside the barracks, stayed with him on the drive home. He thought about Fontenoy, the French field glasses, the British line absorbing fire and not breaking, and not showing at distance any evidence of what it was costing them. They had worn red so their enemies couldn't see them bleed. He had always known that. He had written it in assessment reports and grant applications and museum catalog notes more times than he could count. But there was a difference between knowing a fact and holding the object the fact lived inside. The coat had been in that crate for 80 years. He thought about the man who had hidden it. CHR, the 1943 archivist who had looked at the evacuation lists and the requisition orders and made a calculation that this particular thing was worth the risk of a falsified record, worth the institutional transgression, worth the silence that had followed him to his grave. He had been right. That was the part of the story that didn't make it into catalog notes and never would. Not the provenance, not the condition assessment, not the historical significance. Just this, that in 1943, with London burning and the war grinding through its worst years, one man had looked at an old coat and decided it mattered, and hidden it, and told no one. And been right. Ashworth drove home through London traffic and did not stop for anything. Should military heritage ever be sold to fund active military needs? Fenn's roof was real. His concern for the soldiers training beneath it was genuine. And the coat in that crate was, by any practical measure, doing nothing for anyone. Was he wrong or simply desperate? And if you had been pre-Nair, 11 days into a cataloging job, pulling open a crate that smelled of cedar and 80 years of careful silence, would you have known what you were looking at? Would you have made the call? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. If you believe some things carry a weight that no auction estimate can measure, that the story inside an object is the object, hit the like button now. Subscribe with notifications on, because the most important things are almost always filed under the wrong name, and the next story is already waiting.